The grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club was silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the breathless, electric silence that comes when something extraordinary is happening and no one dares to break the spell. At the center of that silence sat a small 10-year-old girl at a gleaming Steinway grand piano. Her tiny fingers moved across the keys with impossible grace, drawing out notes that seemed to shimmer in the air like living things. The music wasn't simple. It wasn't safe. It was a torrent of emotion, rendered in melody, a story told in harmony so complex that even the trained musicians in the audience found themselves leaning forward, disbelieving. Lily Thompson's braided hair swayed slightly as she moved with the music. Her eyes were closed. Her face, normally shy and uncertain, had transformed into something else entirely. She was somewhere else. Someone else. The music flowed through her like water, like electricity, like pure truth. In the front row, Patricia Thompson sat frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. Tears streamed down her carefully made-up face, ruining her mascara. She had come to this event expecting a simple performance, a few minutes of basic piano, to fulfill a social obligation. What she was witnessing instead defied every expectation she'd ever held. At the back of the ballroom, partially hidden behind one of the marble columns, stood a man who didn't belong there. He wore a faded denim jacket over a flannel shirt, his weathered hands gripping a trucker's cap. His face was lined with decades of hard living, his silver beard neatly trimmed, but unable to hide the emotion working through his features. Tears rolled freely down his weathered cheeks as he listened to music he had written 30 years ago, music he thought would die with him, now being brought to life by his granddaughter. The piece was reaching its crescendo. Lily's hands flew across the keys, building toward something, some revelation that hung in the air like a held breath. And then, but how did we get here? How did a 10-year-old girl from an affluent family end up performing a masterpiece that had been hidden away for 3 decades? Who was the old man crying at the back of the room? What was this piece of music that was leaving a room full of society's elite, stunned into silence? And why was this single performance about to shatter a family's carefully constructed facade and resurrect a legend that everyone thought was dead and buried? The answers to these questions lie in a story of talent, betrayal, redemption, and a bond between a grandfather and granddaughter that would defy all expectations. To understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 weeks earlier, Patricia Thompson stood in her immaculate kitchen holding a cream-colored envelope with gold embossing. The Riverside Country Club's annual charity gala, the event of the season. And this year, her daughter had been selected as one of the young performers. It was exactly the kind of recognition Patricia had been cultivating for years. Since moving to Riverside 5 years ago, she had carefully constructed an image of success, refinement, and belonging. She served on the right committees, attended the right functions, wore the right clothes, and said the right things. Her daughter Lily would play piano at the gala. Something simple, something appropriate. A Beethoven sonatina, perhaps, or a simplified Mozart, something that would demonstrate culture and breeding without drawing too much attention. In Patricia's world, the key was to fit in perfectly, never standing out too much, never falling behind. Lily, she called up the mahogany staircase of their colonial-style home. "Come down here, please. We need to discuss the gala." Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, a small, slender girl with deep brown skin and large, expressive eyes. She wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, her hair pulled back in 2 neat braids. At 10 years old, she carried herself with a quietness that some mistook for shyness, but was really something else. Watchfulness. thoughtfulness. She descended the stairs carefully, one hand on the polished banister. "Yes, Mama." Patricia gestured to the dining room table, where she had already laid out sheet music. "Simple pieces. Safe pieces." Mrs. Vanderburg called. "You'll have exactly 4 minutes for your performance. I've selected 3 pieces you can choose from. All appropriate, all within your skill level." Lily looked at the sheet music. For Elise. A simplified version of Clair de Lune, a basic Chopin prelude, pieces she could play in her sleep, pieces that wouldn't challenge her, pieces that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. "These are all fine," Mama Lily said quietly. "Good. We'll practice every day after school. I want this to be perfect, Lily. Do you understand? This is important for our family." What Patricia didn't say, but what Lily understood perfectly, was what important really meant. It meant maintaining their position. It meant proving they belonged in this world of country clubs and charity galas. It meant erasing any hint of their past, any connection to anything that might be considered common or inappropriate. It meant pretending that certain people didn't exist. "I understand, Mama," Patricia smiled, satisfied. "Wonderful. Now I have a junior league meeting this afternoon. Mrs. Henderson will be here with you until I return. Practice the Chopin. It's the most impressive of the 3. After her mother left, Lily sat at their baby grand piano in the living room. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play the Chopin prelude. Her execution was technically perfect, each note precise and properly timed. But there was no life in it. No soul. She was playing the notes, but not the music. After 15 minutes, she stopped. She looked around to make sure Mrs. Henderson was occupied in the other room. Then she pulled out her phone and sent a text message. "Can I come over this weekend?" The response came 3 minutes later. "Always little bit. Garage doors open." Lily smiled, really smiled for the first time that day. She deleted the text conversation as she always did, and went back to practicing the lifeless Chopin prelude. But her mind was already somewhere else. Somewhere where music meant something different. Somewhere with a man her mother had forbidden her to see. Her grandfather. Raymond Coleman lived in a part of town that Patricia Thompson pretended didn't exist. His neighborhood was working-class, honest, and unpretentious. Small houses with chain-link fences, pickup trucks in driveways, kids playing basketball in the street. It was a world away from Patricia's manicured lawns and homeowners association regulations. Ray's house was a modest single-story structure, painted a faded blue. The garage door was always open during daylight hours, revealing what looked like organized chaos inside. Tools hung on pegboards. Engine parts sat on shelves. And in the back corner, covered with an old tarp, sat an upright piano that hadn't been played in over 2 decades. Ray himself was a study in contradictions. At 68 years old, he was still powerfully built from a lifetime of physical labor. His arms bore faded tattoos from his younger days, images of music notes intertwined with road maps. His face was weathered and lined, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He wore what he always wore: jeans, work boots, and flannel shirts with a denim vest when it got cold. He drove long-haul trucks for a living, spending weeks on the road hauling freight across the country. When he was home, he worked on engines, fixed things for neighbors who couldn't afford mechanics, and tried not to think too much about the life he'd left behind. He also tried not to think too much about the daughter, who was ashamed of him. Patricia had made her feelings clear years ago. After her mother died, after she'd reinvented herself and married into a better life, she'd asked Ray not to contact her anymore. She was building something new, she'd said. She needed to leave the past behind. She needed to forget certain things. She needed to forget who her father really was. Ray had agreed not because he wanted to, but because he loved his daughter and wanted her to be happy. If erasing him from her life would give her the success she craved, then so be it. He'd already lost everything else. What was one more loss? But then 6 months ago, everything had changed. His granddaughter had shown up at his door. Lily had found his address through an old letter. She'd taken 2 buses to get to his neighborhood, something Patricia would have been horrified to know. She'd knocked on his garage door on a Saturday afternoon, nervous and determined. "Are you Raymond Coleman?" she'd asked. Ray had looked at this small girl with his daughter's eyes and his own stubborn chin, and he'd known immediately who she was. "I am. But you can call me Ray, or Grandpa if you want. I'm Lily. I'm your granddaughter. Mama doesn't know I'm here. I figured as much." They'd stared at each other for a long moment. Then Lily had said the words that would change both of their lives. "I heard Mama on the phone once talking to Aunt Denise. She said you used to play piano. She said you were really good before something happened." "Is that true?" Ray had felt something crack open inside his chest. Something he'd kept locked away for so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. "Yeah," he'd said quietly. "Yeah, that's true. Will you teach me?" And just like that, Ray Coleman had found a reason to uncover that old piano in the corner of his garage. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, Lily had been coming to his house every weekend, telling her mother she was at her friend Emma's house. Patricia never checked. She was too busy with her committees and social obligations. Every Saturday and Sunday, Ray taught Lily piano. Not the way she learned at her expensive lessons in town, with their rigid techniques and classical perfectionism. Ray taught her to feel the music, to let it flow through her, to understand that music wasn't about impressing people. It was about truth. Lily had taken to it like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to teach her this way. She was a natural with perfect pitch and an intuitive understanding of harmony. But more than that, she had something Ray recognized because he'd once had it himself. She had soul. What Patricia didn't like to remember, what she'd spent years trying to erase from her personal history, was that her father had once been somebody. Not just somebody. He'd been on his way to becoming a legend. In the 1970s and early 80s, Raymond Coleman was the name on everyone's lips in the jazz world. He'd grown up in Detroit, the son of a factory worker and a church organist. Music was in his blood from the beginning. By age 7, he could play anything he heard. By 15, he was performing in clubs lying about his age. By 20, he was recording his first album. Ray's style was unique. He blended traditional jazz with blues, with gospel, with hints of classical composition. His hands moved across the piano keys like they were having a conversation with God. Critics called him a genius. Other musicians called him an innovator. Audiences called him magical. He performed at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, bringing the crowd to tears with his rendition of A Love Supreme. He played Carnegie Hall, a sold-out show where ticket scalpers were getting 5 times face value. He toured Europe, where they treated jazz musicians like royalty. He recorded 4 albums, each one more critically acclaimed than the last. By 1983, at age 35, Ray Coleman was being mentioned in the same breath as Thelonious Monk Bill Evans and Oscar Peterson. He was on the verge of his biggest breakthrough yet. Columbia Records wanted to sign him to a major deal. He was scheduled to perform at the Newport Jazz Festival as a headliner. His 5th album was in production, and everyone who heard the demo tracks said it would be his masterpiece. He was married to a woman named Sharon, who believed in him completely. They had a 6-year-old daughter named Patricia, who would fall asleep to the sound of her father practicing in the living room. They had a modest but comfortable home. They had dreams. Ray was happy. His career was ascending. His family was healthy. His music was reaching people, touching them, changing them. He was doing what he was born to do. He had everything. And then in a single day, it all came crashing down. The accusation came from Marcus Wentworth, another jazz pianist. Wentworth was talented, but had always lived in the shadow of more successful musicians. He was bitter jealous and willing to do anything to advance his own career. Wentworth claimed that Ray had stolen his composition. He said that Ray's most famous piece, Detroit Requiem, was actually Wentworth's work. He produced documents, had witnesses who would testify, hired lawyers. He made the accusation publicly in interviews in trade publications. It was all a lie. Ray had written Detroit Requiem himself, had dozens of early drafts to prove it had witnesses who'd heard him working on it for months. But none of that mattered. In the music industry, perception is reality. The accusation alone was enough to poison Ray's reputation. Record executives got nervous. Promoters started canceling shows. Other musicians, afraid to be associated with scandal, distanced themselves. Radio stations stopped playing his music. The legal battle took 2 years. Ray spent every dollar he had fighting the charges. He mortgaged his house. He sold his instruments. He watched his wife grow thin with worry as bills piled up. He saw his daughter's confused face when kids at school said her father was a thief. In the end, Ray was technically vindicated. The court found in his favor. The evidence clearly showed he'd written the piece. Wentworth's claims were proven false, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Ray was broke, blacklisted, and broken. The industry had moved on. No one wanted to take a chance on someone associated with scandal, guilty or innocent. The Columbia Records deal evaporated. The festival invitation was withdrawn. Radio stations that had stopped playing his music never started again. Ray tried to rebuild. He played small clubs, took session work, attempted to restart his career. But the magic was gone. Every time he sat at a piano, all he could think about was what he'd lost. The joy had been replaced by bitterness. The passion had been replaced by anger. His marriage couldn't survive the strain. Sharon left when Patricia was 9, taking their daughter with her. "I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore," she'd said. "And I won't let Patricia watch it either." Ray spiraled. He drank. He fought. He stopped playing piano altogether. Music, which had been his salvation, now felt like a curse. Every note reminded him of what had been stolen from him. Not just by Wentworth, but by an industry that had abandoned him when he needed support most. By 1987, Raymond Coleman, the genius who'd been destined for greatness, had given up on music entirely. He sold his last piano. He took a job driving trucks, something that required no creativity, no passion, no soul, just miles and asphalt and time to forget. He disappeared from the music world so completely that people assumed he was dead. And in a way, he was. The Raymond Coleman who'd brought audiences to tears, who'd made piano keys sing with joy and sorrow, who'd poured his heart into every performance. That man was gone. What was left was Ray. Just Ray. A truck driver with calloused hands and a past he didn't talk about. Until a 10-year-old girl knocked on his garage door and asked him to teach her piano. Patricia had been 9 years old when her father's career imploded. Old enough to understand that something terrible was happening. Old enough to hear the arguments, the crying late at night, the phone calls from lawyers and creditors. Old enough to see her father change from someone who smiled and played beautiful music to someone who barely spoke and smelled like whiskey. She'd loved her father then. She'd believed in him. When kids at school called him a cheater, she'd defended him. When her mother packed their bags, Patricia had cried and begged to stay. She'd sat at his feet while he worked on that last composition, the one he'd been writing when everything fell apart. She'd listened to fragments of melodies that he'd never finish. But as she grew older, as her mother worked double shifts to keep them fed as they moved to smaller apartments and struggled to pay bills, Patricia's love curdled into something else. Resentment, embarrassment, anger. Her father had been somebody, and he'd let it all slip away. He'd had talent and opportunity, and he'd lost it. And in losing it, he dragged them down with him. Her mother became bitter and exhausted. Patricia wore second-hand clothes and qualified for free lunch at school. The kids who'd once been impressed that her dad was a musician now mocked her. By the time she was 16, Patricia had made a decision. She would never be like her father. She would never let talent or passion or creativity rule her life. Those things were unreliable. They could be taken away. What mattered was stability, respectability, and image. What mattered was control. She distanced herself from Ray as much as she could while still living with her mother. When she went to college, she barely called. When she met and married Thomas Thompson, a successful real estate developer, she didn't invite her father to the wedding. When Lily was born, she allowed exactly one visit to the hospital before cutting contact completely. I don't want Lily growing up around that, she'd told her mother. Around failure. Around broken dreams. I want her to have better. Her mother had been too tired to argue. Ray hadn't argued either. He'd just looked at his granddaughter once, through the hospital nursery window, then walked away. Patricia convinced herself this was the right thing to do. She built her new life carefully, methodically. She joined the right social circles. She volunteered for the right causes. She ensured that Lily took piano lessons, but only the proper kind with certified teachers who would train her in classical technique for recitals and college applications. Music as a skill, not as a passion. She never told Lily about Ray's past. As far as Lily knew, her maternal grandfather was estranged for vague, unspecified reasons. Patricia's narrative was that Ray had made bad choices and wasn't part of their lives. What Patricia couldn't have known was that her careful control, her constructed image, her determination to erase the past would ultimately lead to its resurrection. That her daughter would seek out the man she'd forbidden. That Lily would find in Ray exactly what Patricia had spent years trying to deny. That sometimes, no matter how hard you try to bury the past, it finds a way to rise again. And sometimes it rises in ways you never expected. The first time Lily sat at Ray's old upright piano 6 months before the charity gala, her hands had trembled. Not from nervousness, but from excitement. This piano was nothing like the pristine baby grand in her living room. The keys were slightly yellowed. Some stuck a little. It needed tuning badly. But there was something about it, some sense of history and stories lived, that made it feel more real than her mother's expensive showpiece. "Play me something," Ray had said, leaning against his workbench with his arms crossed. "Anything you know." Lily had played a simplified Mozart piece the way her regular teacher had instructed her. Proper posture, curved fingers, count the beats, stay in tempo. Don't add interpretation, just play the notes. When she finished, Ray was quiet for a long moment. Then he'd walked over and sat beside her on the bench. "That was technically correct," he'd said, "but it was also dead. You played the notes, but you didn't play the music. You know the difference," Lily had shaken her head. "Notes are just instructions. Music is what happens when you breathe life into those instructions, when you add your soul to someone else's composition. Right now you're playing like a computer, perfect and empty. I'm going to teach you to play like a human being." That first lesson had lasted 3 hours. Ray didn't teach her new pieces or advanced techniques. Instead, he taught her to listen. Really listen. To hear not just the notes, but the spaces between them. To understand that music was a conversation, and every musician had a voice. He played for her, his hands moving over the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone with such rough-weathered hands. He played a simple blues progression, but the way he played it told a story of longing and loss and hope. Lily had felt tears in her eyes without understanding why. "That's what music is supposed to do," Ray had said softly. "It's supposed to make you feel, not think. Feel. Now you try." Those early lessons were revelatory for Lily. Her regular piano teacher focused on technique and perfection. Ray focused on emotion and truth. Her regular teacher told her exactly how to play every note. Ray showed her how to find her own voice within the composition. "Music theory is important," Ray had explained. "You need to understand structure, harmony, rhythm. But that's just the foundation. Once you know the rules, then you can break them in interesting ways. Then you can say something that's uniquely yours." Lily absorbed everything like a sponge. She had natural talent, but more than that, she had been waiting for someone to teach her this way, to give her permission to feel the music instead of just executing it. By the 3rd week, Ray had started showing her jazz standards. By the 6th week, she was improvising simple melodies. By the 8th week, she was sight-reading complex pieces and adding her own interpretations. "You're a natural," Ray had told her one afternoon as she finished playing a Thelonious Monk piece he'd taught her. "You've got the gift. Real musicians, we can spot it. It's not just about technical skill. It's about having something to say through the music." "Did you have the gift?" Lily had asked. Ray's expression had clouded. "Once upon a time, yeah. I did." "What happened?" And slowly, over weeks and months of Saturday and Sunday lessons in that garage, with its oil-stained floor and lingering scent of engine grease, Ray began to tell his granddaughter his story. Not all at once, in pieces, in fragments. The way someone tells a story that still hurts too much to fully confront. Lily learned about her grandfather's career. His rise, his fall, the betrayal, the blacklisting, the loss of everything he'd worked for. She learned why her mother didn't speak to him, why they lived in different worlds. And as Ray told his story, something unexpected happened. He started playing again. Really playing. Not just teaching, but creating. His hands remembered things he thought he'd forgotten. Melodies he'd buried for decades started resurfacing. The joy he'd thought was dead forever began flickering back to life. It was like watching someone wake up from a long sleep. Like watching a wilted plant spring back to life after rain. Lily gave her grandfather back his music, and Ray gave his granddaughter the gift of true artistry. It was a fair trade. Though neither of them realized yet how much that trade would cost, or what it would ultimately give them both. As winter turned to spring, Lily's secret lessons with Ray became the center of her life. She lived for the weekends when she could escape her mother's rigid expectations and disappear into the world her grandfather had created in his garage. Ray's teaching style was unlike anything Lily had experienced. Her regular piano teacher, Mrs. Vanderhoff, was all about discipline and precision. Practice scales. Perfect your arpeggios. Play Hanon exercises until your fingers ache. Perform exactly as written, no deviations. Ray approached music from the opposite direction. Here's the thing about classical training, he'd explained one day while they worked on a Duke Ellington piece. It gives you tools. Important tools. You need to know theory, technique, proper form. But if that's all you have, you're just a really good copyist. You're reproducing someone else's work with technical accuracy but no personal truth. He'd demonstrated by playing Mood Indigo twice, the first time exactly as written perfect and pristine. The second time, with subtle changes in timing, with emotional weight added to certain phrases with his own voice woven through Ellington's composition. Hear the difference. The first version is correct. The second version is alive. That's what separates good musicians from great ones. Great ones take the composition and make it a conversation. They add something of themselves to what the composer wrote. Lily had listened entranced. This was what had been missing from all her previous lessons. The permission to be herself within the music. The understanding that music was a living, breathing thing, not a static artifact to be perfectly reproduced. Their lessons often veered off into unexpected directions. Ray would tell stories about musicians he'd known, legendary performers who'd shaped jazz history. He'd talk about the time he'd played with Dizzy Gillespie at a club in Chicago, how Dizzy had complimented his chord voicings. He'd describe what it felt like to perform at the Apollo, the weight of that stage's history pressing down on him while simultaneously lifting him up. Music is about connection, Ray had said, between the composer and the performer, between the performer and the audience, between the past and the present. When you play, you're having a conversation with everyone who's ever played that piece before you and everyone who'll play it after. You're part of something bigger than yourself. Lily felt that connection deeply. When she played in Ray's garage, she wasn't just executing notes on a page. She was channeling something larger, something that moved through her and connected her to a long lineage of musicians who'd poured their souls into their instruments. She began to understand why her grandfather had been so devastated by losing his career. It wasn't just about fame or money or success. It was about being cut off from this connection, being exiled from the very thing that made him who he was. "Does it still hurt?" she'd asked him one day. "What happened to you?" Ray had been quiet for a long time, his hands resting on the piano keys without pressing down. "Yeah," he'd finally said. "It hurts. Some things don't stop hurting. You just learn to live with the pain, like a broken bone that didn't set quite right. You adapt. You adjust. But it's always there." "I'm sorry," Lily had whispered. "Don't be sorry. Be grateful. You've got the gift, and you're learning how to use it properly. You're getting the education I wish I'd had. Not just technical training, but the understanding of what music really is. You're going to do things I never got the chance to do." As their bond deepened, Ray began opening up about more than just music. He talked about Lily's mother, about the little girl Patricia had been before everything fell apart. He showed Lily old photos from before the scandal, when their family had been intact and happy. He talked about Lily's grandmother Sharon, who'd passed away 5 years earlier from cancer without ever reconciling with Ray. "Your grandma was a good woman," Ray had said, looking at an old photograph. "What happened to us, it wasn't her fault. It wasn't really anybody's fault, except the man who lied and the industry that believed him. But the consequences, they destroyed everything." "Do you hate him?" Lily asked. The man who accused you, Ray, had considered the question carefully. "I did. For a long time I hated him so much it was like poison in my veins. But hate doesn't hurt the person you hate. It hurts you. I've made my peace with it, mostly. What's done is done. I can't change the past. But you could play again," Lily had said. "You could still play. You're so good, Grandpa." "Why did you stop?" Ray's hands had trembled slightly as he touched the piano keys. "Because every time I play, I remember what I lost. Every note is a reminder. It's like, imagine you had something you loved more than anything, and then it was taken from you, and every time you saw it or thought about it, all you could feel was that loss. That's what music became for me, not a joy, but a grief. But you're teaching me, Lily had pointed out. Doesn't that hurt too? Ray had smiled, then a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. You know what? It did at first. But teaching you, watching you discover what music can be, it's like finding water after years in the desert. It's giving me back something I thought was gone forever. They'd sat together in companionable silence after that. Ray's arm around his granddaughter's shoulders, both of them understanding that they'd saved each other in ways that were hard to put into words. But their time was running out. Patricia was going to discover their secret eventually, and when she did, there would be consequences. Consequences neither of them was quite prepared for. It was a Sunday afternoon in early April, 2 months before the charity gala, when Ray finally showed Lily the composition. They'd been working on a particularly challenging Chopin etude when Ray had suddenly stopped mid-phrase and turned to look at Lily with an expression she couldn't quite read. There's something I want to show you, he'd said. Something I've never shown anyone. But I think maybe it's time. He'd gotten up from the piano bench and walked to the back of the garage to a tall metal cabinet covered in faded stickers from various truck stops across America. From the bottom drawer beneath layers of old maps and maintenance logs, he'd pulled out a weathered leather portfolio, its edges worn soft with age. I wrote this in 1983, Ray had said quietly, sitting back down beside Lily. Right before everything fell apart. I was working on my 5th album, and this was going to be the centerpiece, my magnum opus, they used to call it. The piece that would define my career. He'd opened the portfolio to reveal handwritten sheet music, dozens of pages covered in notations, changes, revisions. The paper was yellowed with age, some pages coffee-stained or creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. I called it Redemption Song. Not like the Bob Marley song, this is different. It's my life story. Everything I'd experienced up to that point. Growing up poor in Detroit, finding music, falling in love, success, joy. It was supposed to be a celebration, a jazz ballad that captured what it felt like to be alive and grateful and full of hope. Lily had looked at the complex notations, the intricate harmonies woven through the composition. Even to her relatively untrained eye, she could see the sophistication, the genius in how the piece was constructed. Why didn't you finish it? She'd asked. I did finish it. Musically, anyway. Every note is there. But I never performed it. The scandal broke right before I was supposed to debut it at Newport. After that, I couldn't bring myself to play it. It was too much. This piece was about hope and gratitude and joy, and I didn't feel any of those things anymore. Playing it would have been like lying, like pretending everything was okay when my whole world had just crumbled. Ray had run his fingers over the first page of sheet music, his touch gentle, almost reverent. I kept telling myself that someday I'd perform it, when I was vindicated, when people realized the truth, when I got my career back. But that day never came, and eventually I accepted it never would. This piece would die with me unheard, just ink on paper, a ghost of what might have been. Will you play it for me? Lily had whispered. Ray had looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he'd turned back to the piano. His hands had positioned themselves on the keys. He'd taken a deep breath. And then he'd played. The music that filled the garage was unlike anything Lily had ever heard. It started with a simple melody, almost childlike in its innocence. But then it grew, becoming more complex, adding layers. There were echoes of blues, hints of gospel, sophisticated jazz harmonies that wove in and out like conversations. The piece moved through movements like chapters in a book, each one telling part of a story. There was joy in it, yes, but also sorrow. Struggle and triumph, loss and hope. It was a piece that captured the full spectrum of human experience, rendered in music so beautiful it made Lily's chest ache. Ray's playing was imperfect. His fingers stumbled occasionally, his timing was rusty. He was reading from 30-year-old sheet music that he hadn't looked at in decades. But even with the imperfections, the power of the composition shone through. When he finished, his hands remained on the keys, trembling slightly. There were tears on his cheeks. Lily realized she was crying too. "Grandpa," she'd said, her voice breaking. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. It was supposed to be my legacy," Ray had said quietly. "The piece that people would remember me for." Instead, it became a ghost. A what if? Lily had looked at the sheet music, at her grandfather's weathered face, at the piano that had been silent for so long. And in that moment, a thought had formed in her mind. A wild, impossible, terrifying thought. "Teach me," she'd said. Ray had looked at her in surprise. "Lily, this piece it's far beyond your skill level. It's technically complex. It would take years to master. Even experienced pianists would struggle with it." "Teach me anyway," Lily had insisted. "Please, you said this was supposed to be your legacy. Let me carry it for you. Let me be the one who brings it into the world. Your mother would never allow it. She doesn't have to know. Not yet. Just teach me. If I can't do it, fine. But let me try. Please, Grandpa. Let me give this piece the life it deserves." Ray had stared at his granddaughter, seeing the determination in her eyes. The same determination that had driven him once upon a time. The same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had defined his career before it was taken from him. "It'll be the hardest thing you've ever done," he'd warned. "I don't care. You'll want to give up 100 times. I won't. It might not work. You might not be able to master it in time. Then I'll fail trying. But I'm going to try." Ray had looked at the sheet music, then back at his granddaughter. Something had shifted in his expression. A decision being made. A door being opened after being locked for 30 years. "Okay," he'd said finally. "Okay, we'll try. But this stays between us. If your mother finds out..." "She won't." Lily had promised. A promise she had no idea how impossible it would be to keep. And so they'd begun. 2 months before the charity gala, Ray started teaching Lily the most complex, sophisticated, emotionally demanding piece of music he'd ever composed. A piece that would challenge a concert pianist with decades of experience. A piece that a 10-year-old girl was determined to master no matter what it cost. Learning Redemption Song was like trying to climb a mountain with no training. Every time Lily thought she'd made progress, she'd discover another peak ahead. Another challenge that seemed insurmountable. The piece was in 5 movements, each one telling a different chapter of Ray's story. The first movement, Origins, was relatively simple, but it set up melodic themes that would be transformed and referenced throughout the rest of the composition. The second movement, Ascent, was technically demanding with rapid runs and complex chord progressions. The third movement, Betrayal, was dark and dissonant, pushing the boundaries of jazz harmonies. The fourth movement, Wilderness, was a slow, aching exploration of loss. And the fifth movement, Redemption, brought all the themes together in a triumphant conclusion. In the first week, Lily could barely make it through the first movement without her fingers cramping. The reaches were too wide for her small hands. The rhythms were subtle and complex, requiring a sophistication beyond her experience. The emotional interpretation that Ray demanded felt impossible to achieve. Again, Ray would say, patient but uncompromising. You're playing the notes, but you're not feeling it. This section is about innocence, about discovering music for the first time. Let me hear that joy. Lily would try again, and again, and again. Her fingers ached. Her back hurt from maintaining proper posture for hours. Her mind felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what she was attempting. There were nights when she'd go home and cry in her bedroom, convinced she'd never be able to do it. The piece was too hard. She was too inexperienced. She'd bitten off more than she could chew, but then she'd think about her grandfather, about the way his eyes lit up when she made progress, about the lost years he'd spent in exile from the thing he loved most, about this piece of music that deserved to be heard but never had been. And she'd dry her tears, pull out her regular homework, and start planning her next practice session. By the end of the first month, she could play through the entire piece, albeit slowly and with numerous mistakes. Ray was amazed at her progress. "You've got something special," he'd tell her. "Most students would have given up by now. But you're pushing through. That's not just talent, that's determination, that's character." The second month was about refinement. Now that Lily could technically execute the piece, Ray focused on interpretation, on making each note mean something, on finding the emotional truth within the composition. This section here, he'd explain, pointing to a particularly complex passage in the third movement. This is where everything falls apart. The betrayal. The moment when the world turns against you. Feel that. Channel it. Not anger, but confusion. Hurt. The disbelief that this is happening. Lily would play the passage again this time, thinking about the story behind it. About her grandfather standing accused of something he didn't do. About watching his career crumble. About the helplessness of being unable to defend himself against lies. And the music would change. Would deepen, would become more than just notes on a page. They worked on dynamics, on pacing, on the subtle variations in timing that could transform a mechanical performance into an emotional journey. They worked on how to transition between movements, how to build tension, how to create moments of release. Music is about managing expectations, Ray had explained. You create tension by setting up patterns and then breaking them. You create beauty by contrast, setting dissonance against harmony. You create meaning by having a conversation between the different themes. See how this melody from the first movement comes back in the fifth, but transformed. That's telling the listener something, that the innocence of the beginning has been tested and refined by experience. Lily absorbed everything. She practiced until her fingers were sore. She played through mistakes and frustrations. She learned that mastery wasn't about being perfect. It was about understanding so deeply that even mistakes could be incorporated meaningfully. By late May, 6 weeks before the gala, Lily could play Redemption Song all the way through with only minor errors. She understood the emotional arc of the piece. She could interpret the subtle nuances that made it more than just technically impressive. But there was still something missing. Some final element that Ray kept pushing her toward. "You're playing my story," he'd said one evening. "And you're doing it beautifully. But for this to truly work, you need to make it your story too. You need to find the connection between my experience and yours. The universal truth that makes this piece resonate with anyone who hears it." "I don't understand," Lily had said, frustrated. "You will," Ray had assured her. "When the time comes, you'll understand. Trust me." What neither of them realized was that the final ingredient, the element that would transform Lily's performance from technically impressive to truly transcendent, was about to be provided by circumstances beyond their control. By the revelation of their secret, by confrontation, and crisis, by being forced to choose between safety and truth. The discovery happened on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks before the charity gala. Patricia had come home early from a junior league meeting, her head aching from 2 hours of budget discussions and personality conflicts. She'd walked into the house expecting to find Lily practicing her Chopin prelude for the gala. Instead, she'd found Lily at the piano playing something else entirely, something complex and sophisticated and utterly unlike anything a 10-year-old should be playing. Patricia had stood in the doorway, frozen, listening to her daughter perform a piece of music that was clearly far beyond what Mrs. Vanderhoff had been teaching her. Where had Lily learned this? How was she capable of playing something so advanced? When Lily had finished, Patricia had walked into the room. "What was that?" she'd asked, her voice tight. Lily had spun around on the piano bench, her face flushing with guilt. Just something I've been working on. That wasn't any of the pieces we selected for the gala. Where did you learn it? I found some sheet music online. I wanted to challenge myself. Patricia had felt something cold settle in her stomach. Lily was lying. She could tell. Her daughter was a terrible liar. Always had been. Lily Thompson, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where did you learn that piece? Lily had looked down at her hands. Grandpa Ray has been teaching me. The words had hit Patricia like a physical blow. What I've been going to his house on weekends. He's been teaching me piano. Real piano. Not just the technical stuff, but how to actually play. How to make music mean something. You've been seeing my father. Patricia's voice had risen despite her efforts to stay calm. After I explicitly told you to stay away from him. You never told me to stay away from him. You just never talked about him at all. I didn't even know he existed until I overheard you on the phone with Aunt Denise. I had reasons for keeping him out of our lives, Lily. Good reasons. He's not the kind of influence I want around you. Why? Because he failed. Because he lost everything. He's brilliant, Mama. He used to be famous. Did you know that? Did you know people paid hundreds of dollars to hear him play? Patricia had felt old anger rising in her chest. I know exactly who my father used to be. I also know who he became. A drunk, a failure, someone who gave up, someone who threw away every opportunity he had. I won't let you romanticize his life, Lily. I won't let you think that what happened to him is acceptable. That's not fair. He didn't give up. The industry gave up on him. He was accused of something he didn't do, and everyone believed it, and no one gave him a second chance. Life isn't fair, Lily. That's the lesson. You can't rely on talent or passion. You need stability, structure, a proper career path, not pipe dreams about being an artist. Is that why you never told me about him? Because you're ashamed? Because he doesn't fit your perfect image? Patricia had felt the accusation like a slap. I built this life for you, so you wouldn't have to struggle the way I did. So you wouldn't have to worry about money or reputation or whether we'd have enough to eat. I did that. And I won't apologize for wanting better for my daughter. Better. You want me to play soulless music at a boring event for rich people who don't actually care. That's better. Grandpa Ray taught me what music really is. He taught me to feel it, not just execute it. And you want me to forget that, to go back to playing like a robot. I want you to play appropriately. I want you to understand that there are consequences to standing out, to being different. I want you to learn from your grandfather's mistakes instead of repeating them. What if I don't want to learn from his mistakes? What if I want to learn from his successes? Patricia had walked to the piano, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. She'd pulled out the sheet music Lily had been playing from. Complex notations, advanced harmonies, her father's handwriting in the margins, annotations, and guidance. You will not see him again, Patricia had said, her voice hard. Do you understand me? This stops now. Whatever romantic notions he's put in your head about being an artist, they end today. You can't stop me from seeing him. He's my grandfather. I absolutely can, and I am. You're 10 years old, Lily. I'm your mother. And I'm telling you that you are forbidden from having any contact with Raymond Coleman. This isn't fair. Life isn't fair. That's the lesson my father learned, and now I'm teaching it to you before you have to learn it the hard way. Patricia had gathered up all the sheet music, including the handwritten pages of Redemption Song. You will play the Chopin Prelude at the Gala. Something simple. Something appropriate. Something that won't draw attention or make people uncomfortable. Do you understand? Lily had tears streaming down her face. I understand that you're afraid. You're afraid of being associated with someone who failed. You're so worried about what other people think that you can't see what's real and what matters. When you're older, you'll understand why I'm doing this. When I'm older, I'm going to be just like Grandpa Ray. I'm going to make music that means something. And I won't care what people like you think about it. Patricia had felt those words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Go to your room. We'll discuss this further when your father gets home. Lily had run upstairs, slamming her bedroom door. Patricia had stood alone in the living room, clutching the sheet music, feeling like she was back in that moment decades ago, when her own father's career had imploded and she'd learned that love and talent weren't enough to protect you from the world. She'd thought she was protecting her daughter, teaching her a necessary lesson, saving her from heartbreak. What she didn't realize was that she was setting in motion the very confrontation she'd spent years trying to avoid. That by trying to silence the past, she was ensuring it would return louder than ever. That some things once set in motion can't be stopped. For 3 weeks, Lily and Patricia didn't speak beyond the bare minimum. The tension in the Thompson household was thick enough to choke on. Thomas Thompson tried to mediate, but he didn't fully understand the depths of what was happening. He only knew that his wife and daughter were locked in some battle of wills that neither seemed willing to concede. Patricia had confiscated Lily's phone. She'd driven Lily to and from school herself. She'd monitored every moment. There would be no sneaking off to Ray's house, no secret lessons, no more inappropriate music. Lily practiced the Chopin Prelude as instructed, playing it with perfect technical precision and absolutely no soul. It was a rebellion of its own kind, a demonstration of how hollow music became when it was just about execution without meaning. But inside, Lily was planning. The gala was less than a week away. She'd spent 2 months learning Redemption Song. She'd poured her heart into mastering it, and she wasn't going to let her mother's fear stop her from giving that piece the life it deserved. On the night before the gala, Patricia was out at a final preparation meeting. Thomas was in his study working. The house was quiet. Lily snuck out her bedroom window, climbed down the trellis on the side of the house, and ran the 12 blocks to Ray's neighborhood. She found him in his garage, as always. He looked up in surprise when she appeared breathless and determined. Little bit. What are you doing here? If your mother... I don't care, Lily had interrupted. I don't care what she says anymore. I'm playing your piece tomorrow, at the gala. Ray had stood up from his workbench, his expression conflicted. Lily, you can't. Your mother will what, be angry? She's already angry. Will she be embarrassed? Good. She should be. She spent years being ashamed of you for no reason. Maybe it's time she sees what she's been missing. This isn't about me, Lily. It's about you. You have to live with her. You have to navigate your life. I don't want to be the cause of more problems between you and your mother. You're not the cause. Her fear is the cause. Her inability to see past what other people think. You taught me that music is about truth, about saying something real. Well, this is my truth. Your piece deserves to be heard. And I'm the one who's going to do it. Ray had sat down heavily on his workbench stool. It'll change everything. You understand that once you play that piece, once people know about it, there's no going back. Your mother's carefully constructed world will be disrupted. Maybe it needs to be disrupted. Maybe we've all been pretending for too long." They'd sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Finally, Ray had walked to an old cardboard box in the corner of his garage. From it, he'd pulled out a leather jacket worn soft with age, with the Apollo Theater patch on the back. "I wore this the night I played the Apollo," he'd said quietly. "Best performance of my life up until that point. I was 32 years old and I thought I had the world figured out. Thought talent and determination were enough. Thought the music would protect me." He'd held the jacket out to Lily. "I want you to have this. Tomorrow when you play, I want you to wear this under your dress, so you remember where you come from. So you remember that making art, real art, requires courage. And so you remember that I'm with you even if I can't be in that room." Lily had taken the jacket, feeling the weight of it, the history embedded in the worn leather. "You could be there. You could come to the gala. I wasn't invited. And my presence would only make things harder for you. This is your moment, little bit. You've earned it. You've put in the work. You've found the soul of the piece. Now you need to be brave enough to share it." "I'm scared," Lily had admitted. "What if I mess up? What if I freeze? What if everyone hates it? Then you'll have been brave enough to try. That's all that matters. Not success or failure, but courage." Most people never take the risk. They play it safe their whole lives and wonder why nothing ever means anything. You're not most people, Lily. You've got something to say, and you've got the ability to say it. Don't let fear stop you. They'd practiced Redemption Song one more time that night. All the way through, no stops, no corrections. Lily played it perfectly, or as close to perfect as made no difference. More importantly, she played it with understanding, with soul, with the weight of everything she'd learned over the past 6 months. When she finished, Ray had tears in his eyes. "That's it," he'd said quietly. "That's the piece as it was meant to be played. You've done it, little bit. You've brought it to life." "Will you come?" Lily had asked one more time. "Please. Even if you stay in the back, I want you to hear it. I want you to be there when your piece finally gets performed." Ray had struggled with the decision. He'd spent years avoiding the music world, avoiding his past, avoiding the pain. But looking at his granddaughter, at the hope in her eyes, he'd found himself nodding. "I'll be there," he'd promised. "I won't let your mother see me, but I'll be there, listening." Lily had hugged him fiercely. Then she'd put on the leather jacket, feeling like she was putting on armor. She climbed back out into the night, sneaking home the way she'd come, carrying with her a secret that would detonate the next evening like a bomb. Patricia never knew her daughter had been gone. She came home from her meeting, checked on Lily, saw her apparently asleep in bed, and went to sleep herself, satisfied that everything was under control. She had no idea that control was an illusion, that the next night would shatter every carefully constructed barrier she'd built, that the past she'd spent years trying to bury was about to rise up and demand recognition, that sometimes the only way to move forward is to finally confront what you've been running from. The day of the charity gala dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect spring evenings that seemed designed for significant events. Patricia Thompson moved through the house with the efficiency of a general preparing for battle. Every detail had to be perfect. Lily's dress hung in her closet, a pale blue confection that Patricia had spent weeks selecting. Conservative but elegant, age-appropriate but sophisticated. The kind of dress that would fit in perfectly at the Riverside Country Club without drawing undue attention. "I've arranged for Catherine to do your hair at 3, Patricia informed Lily over breakfast. Your performance is scheduled for 7:30, but we need to arrive by 6 for photos and pre-event mingling. Your father will meet us there directly from the office." Lily nodded, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. She hadn't slept well, adrenaline and nervousness keeping her awake most of the night. Today was the day. Everything was about to change. "You've been practicing the Chopin, Patricia?" asked, studying her daughter's face. "Yes, Mama." "You're ready?" "Yes, Mama." Patricia had felt a flicker of unease. Something in Lily's tone wasn't quite right, but she dismissed it. Pre-performance nerves. Perfectly normal. At 3 o'clock, Catherine arrived to style Lily's hair. She twisted the braids into an elegant updo, weaving in small pearl pins. "You look like a princess," Catherine had declared. At 4:30, Lily got dressed. The pale blue dress fit perfectly, falling just below her knees. Patricia helped with the zipper, adjusting the ribbon sash. What Patricia didn't see was the leather jacket tucked into Lily's garment bag, hidden between layers of tissue paper. What she didn't know was that her daughter had no intention of playing the safe, simple Chopin prelude. By 5:45, they were in the car driving toward the country club. Patricia reviewed last-minute instructions. "Remember when you're introduced, smile and walk confidently to the piano. Adjust the bench if you need to. Take a moment to compose yourself. Then play. Don't rush. Don't add any unnecessary flourishes. Just play it as you've practiced." "I will, Mama." The Riverside Country Club's ballroom was transformed for the evening. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white-clothed tables, adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces. The stage at one end of the room featured a magnificent Steinway grand piano, polished until it gleamed. Well-dressed guests milled about champagne flutes in hand, their laughter and conversation creating a refined buzz. Patricia was in her element. She knew everyone greeted them by name, made small talk with practiced ease. This was her world, the world she'd built for herself and her family. Everything was perfect. Lily stood beside her mother, smiling when appropriate, shaking hands, when introduced, all the while feeling like she was watching from outside her body. In her mind, she was going over the first movement of Redemption song, hearing Ray's voice coaching her. "Start soft, almost tentative. You're telling the story of a beginning. Let it grow naturally." At 7:15, the event coordinator, a thin woman named Marcia, approached them. "Lily, dear, you'll be on in 15 minutes. Do you need a few moments to warm up?" Lily nodded. "Yes, please. There's a practice room just off the hallway. Take all the time you need." Lily walked to the practice room, Patricia following. Inside was an upright piano, nowhere near as nice as the Steinway on stage, but serviceable for warming up. "Play through it once," Patricia instructed. "Make sure you're comfortable." Lily sat at the piano. She placed her hands on the keys. And then, instead of the Chopin prelude, she played the opening bars of Redemption song. Patricia's eyes widened. "Lily, what are you doing?" "That's not I'm playing this," Lily said quietly, continuing to play. "This is what I'm performing tonight." "Absolutely not. We agreed." "The Chopin. You agreed." "I never did. I'm playing Grandpa Ray's piece. It's already decided." Patricia's face flushed with anger and panic. "Lily Thompson, you will not. Do you understand me? You will not embarrass this family. I'm not embarrassing anyone. I'm honoring someone who deserves it, someone you've been too ashamed to acknowledge. You're being incredibly selfish. This isn't about you or your grandfather. This is about our family's reputation, about fitting in, about you being afraid," Lily interrupted. "You're afraid of what people will think. You're afraid of being associated with failure. But you know what I'm more afraid of being like you, of spending my whole life worried about other people's opinions, of playing it safe and never saying anything real. Before Patricia could respond, there was a knock on the door. Marcia stuck her head in. "Lily, you're on in 5 minutes, sweetheart." Lily stood up from the piano. She walked to her garment bag and pulled out Ray's leather jacket. She put it on over her pale blue dress. "Lily, take that off right now," Patricia hissed. "No, you're going to play the Chopin prelude right now, or you're not playing at all." Lily looked at her mother, and in that moment she saw not an adversary, but someone who was terrified. Terrified of the past. Terrified of judgment. Terrified of losing the carefully constructed life she'd built. "I love you, Mama," Lily said quietly. "But I'm doing this. And afterwards maybe you'll understand why." She walked out of the practice room, leaving Patricia standing there, frozen between anger and helplessness. This was happening. There was no stopping it now. And this brings us back to where we started. To the moment when Lily Thompson sat at that gleaming Steinway grand piano, her small fingers poised over the keys, the weight of a 30-year-old secret resting on her 10-year-old shoulders. To the silence in the ballroom as hundreds of people waited for a simple, safe performance of classical music. To Patricia, in the front row, torn between horror and helplessness, realizing she'd lost control of the narrative. To Ray, at the back of the room, hidden behind a marble column, barely breathing, about to hear his greatest work performed for the first time. This was the moment, the point of no return, the instant before everything changed. Lily took a deep breath. She thought about everything Ray had taught her, about music being truth, about courage being more important than safety, about how some things are worth the risk. She placed her hands on the keys, and she began to play. The first notes of Redemption Song floated into the air like a question, soft, almost hesitant. The melody was simple, childlike even, but there was something about it that made people pause their conversations and turn toward the stage. This wasn't Chopin. This wasn't any classical piece they recognized. Lily kept her eyes closed, letting muscle memory guide her fingers while her mind lived inside the music. The first movement, Origins, was about beginning, about discovering music for the first time, about innocence and wonder. Her hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone her size. The melody grew, adding complexity, introducing harmonies that hinted at the sophistication to come. This was jazz, but not like any jazz these society guests had heard at their usual functions. This was something deeper, more personal. In the front row, Patricia sat frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. Part of her wanted to stand up to stop this, to drag her daughter off that stage. But another part of her, a part she'd been suppressing for decades, was transfixed. Because this music, this piece her daughter was playing with such confidence and skill, was breathtakingly beautiful. Around the ballroom, conversation had stopped entirely. People were setting down their champagne glasses, turning their chairs toward the stage. The event organizers looked confused, checking their programs. This wasn't what was scheduled, but it was too late to interrupt now. At the back of the room, Ray Coleman gripped his trucker's cap so hard his knuckles turned white. He was hearing his composition played for the first time by someone other than himself. And it was better than he'd imagined. Lily wasn't just playing the notes. She understood them. She'd made them her own while still honoring his original intent. Tears began rolling down his weathered cheeks. The first movement transitioned seamlessly into the second ascent. The tempo increased. The harmonies became more complex. Lily's hands flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision, playing runs that would challenge musicians twice her age. This was the section about success, about climbing toward your dreams, about the exhilaration of doing what you were meant to do. Gasps rippled through the audience. This was no simple piano recital. This was something else entirely. This 10-year-old girl was performing like a concert pianist, bringing to life music that was sophisticated, emotional, and utterly captivating. Mrs. Vanderhoff, Lily's regular piano teacher, sat in shock. When had her student learned to play like this? This level of skill, this depth of interpretation didn't come from their weekly lessons. This was something else. Someone else had taught her this. Thomas Thompson, who'd been mingling near the bar, pushed through the crowd to reach his wife. "Patricia, what is she playing? That's not the piece we discussed." Patricia couldn't answer. She just shook her head, tears starting to form in her eyes. Because suddenly, she was back in time. Back to being a little girl sitting in the audience while her father played at venues just like this. Back to the feeling of pride she'd had watching him command a room with nothing but his hands and a piano. Back to the moment before everything fell apart, when music had been magic instead of a source of shame. The second movement climaxed in a flourish of notes, then softened, transitioning into the third movement, betrayal. The mood shifted dramatically. The harmonies became dissonant, unsettling. This was where the piece got dark, where Ray's story took its tragic turn. Lily played with controlled intensity, each note sharp and deliberate, creating a sense of things falling apart. Some people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the pleasant background music they'd expected. This was challenging them, making them feel things, making them uncomfortable in the best possible way. Lily opened her eyes for the first time, looking out at the audience. She saw her mother's tears. She saw the stunned faces around the room. She saw in the very back, partially hidden by a column, her grandfather. Their eyes met across the distance. Ray nodded once slightly, and Lily smiled. She poured everything she had into the fourth movement, Wilderness. This was the longest section, the emotional core of the piece. It was about loss, about wandering in darkness, about feeling forgotten and abandoned. But it was also about perseverance, about continuing to breathe, to exist, to hope, even when hope seemed impossible. The music was so achingly beautiful that people throughout the ballroom began crying without fully understanding why. It was touching something primal in them, some shared human experience of loss and resilience. Patricia was sobbing openly now, no longer caring about her makeup or her reputation or what anyone thought, because she finally understood. This music was her father's story, yes, but it was also her story. Her loss. Her exile from something beautiful because of fear and pride. The fourth movement built slowly toward resolution, the darkness gradually giving way to hints of light. And then, like dawn breaking after the longest night, the fifth movement began. Redemption. The final movement of Redemption Song was where everything Ray Coleman had learned, everything he'd experienced, everything he'd lost, and found again came together in a triumph of musical storytelling. It started with a callback to the innocent melody from the first movement, but transformed, wiser, scarred, but stronger. The childlike wonder was still there, but tempered now with experience and understanding. Lily played it with such depth of feeling that it seemed impossible this was coming from a 10-year-old. The melody wove in and out of jazz harmonies, incorporating elements from all the previous movements. Fragments of ascent appeared, reminding listeners of the joy of success. Echoes of betrayal added complexity, showing that scars don't disappear. They become part of who you are. The aching beauty of Wilderness was there too, but transformed into something that acknowledged pain while refusing to be defined by it. This was music about surviving, about finding meaning in struggle, about the possibility of second chances. Around the ballroom, people were completely transfixed. Some stood with hands over their hearts. Others sat forward in their chairs, not wanting to miss a single note. The waitstaff had stopped serving. The bartenders had stopped pouring. Everyone was caught in the spell that Lily was weaving with Ray's music. Patricia watched her daughter with a mixture of emotions so complex she couldn't untangle them. Pride, fear, regret, wonder, grief for lost time, hope for what might come next. This was her child up there, doing something extraordinary, something Patricia had spent years trying to prevent. And it was perfect. Beside her, Thomas gripped her hand, his own eyes wet with tears. "My God," he whispered, "she's incredible." Across the room, other parents were having similar revelations. How many of them had been pushing their children toward safe, respectable paths? How many had been discouraging dreams in favor of security? How many had forgotten what it felt like to pursue something with passion instead of pragmatism? The music was asking all of them these questions, making them confront their own compromises and lost dreams. Near the back, standing partially hidden, Ray listened to his composition with a feeling he'd thought was lost forever. Vindication. Not the bitter, angry vindication he'd sometimes fantasized about during his lowest moments, but something gentler, sweeter. The simple recognition that what he'd created had value, that it deserved to be heard, that his 30 years of silence had ended not with a whimper, but with a soaring declaration that he'd existed, he'd mattered, he'd created something beautiful that would outlive the scandal and the pain. Lily had given him back more than his music. She'd given him back his dignity. The fifth movement built toward its climax, Lily's hands moving across the keys with absolute confidence now. Every doubt, every moment of wanting to give up during those grueling practice sessions, every sacrifice had been worth it for this moment. She wasn't just performing her grandfather's music, she was telling his story. She was bearing witness to a life that deserved to be remembered. The music swelled, filling every corner of the ballroom, impossible to ignore or dismiss. It demanded attention. It demanded recognition. It demanded that everyone listening acknowledge the truth being told through these notes. And then, in the final section, the piece did something unexpected. It didn't end on a triumphant major chord, the kind of neat resolution that would have been easy and satisfying. Instead, it ended on a complex jazz chord that was simultaneously resolved and questioning, satisfied but still reaching. It was an ending that acknowledged that life doesn't tie up neatly, that redemption doesn't erase what came before, that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. Lily held the final chord, letting it ring out into the silence, her foot on the sustain pedal, letting every harmonic overtone shimmer in the air. She kept her hands on the keys even after the sound faded. Her head bowed, her breath coming in quick gasps from the physical and emotional exertion. The ballroom was absolutely silent, not the polite silence of people waiting to applaud, but the stunned silence of people who'd just experienced something that had fundamentally moved them, something they needed a moment to process before reacting. Lily lifted her hands from the keys. She opened her eyes. She looked out at the sea of faces staring back at her. Still silence. Had she failed? Had it been too much, too intense, too different from what they'd expected? And then from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. The applause started with Ray. He couldn't help himself. Standing at the back of the ballroom, tears streaming freely down his face, he began to clap. Slowly at first, then harder, faster. The sound broke the spell. Someone near the front stood up, joining the applause, then another person, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, applauding thunderously. It wasn't the polite, measured applause of a society function. It was genuine, spontaneous, overwhelming. People were crying. Strangers were hugging each other. Some were applauding while wiping tears from their eyes. The ovation went on and on, wave after wave of appreciation and recognition. Lily stood up from the piano bench, overwhelmed. She looked out at the standing crowd, at her mother standing in the front row, sobbing. At her father beside her, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. At the hundreds of faces all focused on her. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The event coordinator, Marcia, rushed onto the stage, her own eyes red from crying. She had to gesture several times before the applause died down enough for her to speak into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. That was extraordinary. Lily, honey, can you tell us what you just played? That wasn't on the program. Lily took the microphone with trembling hands. Her voice when she spoke was small but clear, amplified throughout the ballroom. It's called Redemption Song. It was composed by my grandfather, Raymond Coleman. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the older guests exchanged glances. That name was familiar. Where had they heard it before? My grandfather used to be a jazz pianist. Lily continued gaining confidence. In the 1970s and 80s, he was really famous. He played at Carnegie Hall and the Apollo Theater. But then something happened. He was accused of something he didn't do, and the music industry turned their back on him. He lost everything. The murmur grew louder. People were remembering now. The scandal, the accusations, the case that had been in all the music publications 3 decades ago. He wrote this piece in 1983, before everything fell apart. He never got to perform it. It's been hidden away for 30 years. He taught it to me. And tonight I wanted to give it the audience it deserved. I wanted people to hear the truth about my grandfather, that he was talented, that he was real, that he mattered. Lily looked toward the back of the room, toward where Ray stood. "Grandpa, will you come up here, please?" Every head in the ballroom turned to follow her gaze. Ray stood frozen, caught in the spotlight of hundreds of eyes. For a moment it looked like he might run, might disappear back into the obscurity he'd lived in for so long. But then he took a step forward, and another. The crowd parted as he walked slowly through the ballroom. This weathered man in a denim jacket and flannel shirt, so out of place in this world of evening gowns and tuxedos. As he walked, some of the older guests began to recognize him. Whispers spread. "My God, is that really Raymond Coleman? I thought he was dead. I heard him play once 40 years ago. I'll never forget it." The plagiarism case. Wasn't he proven innocent? Ray reached the stage. He climbed the steps slowly, like a man walking to his execution or his coronation, uncertain which. He stood beside his granddaughter, this tiny girl in a blue dress and a leather jacket, who'd just resurrected his life's work. Lily handed him the microphone. Ray stood there looking out at the crowd. He hadn't stood on a stage in front of an audience in over 30 years. He'd thought he never would again. His hands were shaking. His eyes were full of tears. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice rough. "That piece, I wrote it a lifetime ago, when I was a different person, when I thought I understood how the world worked. I never thought anyone would hear it. I'd made my peace with that. And then this one," he put his hand on Lily's shoulder, "showed up at my garage 6 months ago, and asked me to teach her piano. He paused, struggling with emotion. I'd given up on music. I'd given up on a lot of things. But she didn't give up on me. She found that old composition. She insisted on learning it. She worked harder than any student I ever taught. And tonight she gave me back something I thought was gone forever. His voice broke. She gave me back my voice. The ballroom erupted in applause again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just appreciation for a performance. It was recognition, acknowledgement, an apology from a world that had failed him 3 decades ago. In the front row, Patricia stood with tears streaming down her face, watching her father on that stage, watching her daughter beside him, seeing them together, seeing the bond between them, seeing the joy and pride in both their faces. All the years she'd spent being ashamed, all the effort she'd put into erasing her past and constructing a new identity, all the time she'd wasted being afraid of what people would think. And here they were, her father and her daughter, receiving a standing ovation from the very society Patricia had been so desperate to impress. Not by hiding who they were, but by being completely, authentically themselves. She'd been wrong. About everything. Patricia pushed her way through the crowd. She climbed onto the stage. Ray saw her coming, and his expression changed to wariness, expecting confrontation even now. But Patricia didn't confront him. She walked straight to her father and wrapped her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said, barely audible over the continuing applause. "I'm so sorry, Daddy. For everything. For all of it." Ray's arms came up around his daughter, this woman he'd barely spoken to in decades. "It's okay, Patty. It's all okay now. I was so angry. For so long, I blamed you for what happened, but you didn't do anything wrong. They did, and I should have stood by you. I should have believed in you. You were just a kid. You did what you needed to do to survive, but I should have been better. I should have been like her." Patricia pulled back to look at Lily, who was watching this reconciliation with tears in her own eyes. "She's braver than I ever was." Ray smiled through his tears. "She's brave like you used to be, before the world taught you to be afraid. She's reminding both of us who we used to be, who we could still be." The 3 of them stood on that stage, a family fractured and now healing, while around them the ballroom full of society's elite bore witness to something they'd never expected to see at a charity gala. Real emotion, real art, real redemption. The rest of the charity gala became something else entirely. What had been a formal, proper society event transformed into an impromptu celebration of music and second chances. After the Thompsons left the stage, people crowded around Ray. Some were musicians who'd known him in his prime. Others were simply fans of jazz who recognized his name and his significance. They asked questions. They shared memories. They apologized for believing the accusations all those years ago. "I saw you play at the Village Vanguard in 1981, an older man said, gripping Ray's hand. "Changed my life. I've been looking for that recording for years. I wrote my master's thesis on your album, Detroit Sessions," a woman in her 50s said. "It's still the most innovative jazz piano work I've ever analyzed. What happened to you was a travesty. Do you still play?" someone asked. "Do you perform anymore?" Ray had barely known how to respond. For so long he'd been invisible, forgotten, and now suddenly people were seeing him again. Really seeing him. Not as a cautionary tale or a failure, but as the artist he'd once been. Across the room, Lily was surrounded by her own crowd. Young people, parents, teachers, all wanting to know her story. How long had she been playing? Where did she study? Would she perform again? Patricia and Thomas stood together, watching their daughter handle the attention with grace and confidence. Patricia felt Thomas's arm around her shoulders. "I had no idea," he said quietly. About your father. About any of this. Why didn't you tell me I was ashamed?" Patricia admitted. "Of him. Of where I came from. I wanted to be someone different. Someone who belonged in this world. You do belong here, Patty. But not because you erased your past. You belong because you're smart and capable and strong. Your father's story doesn't diminish that. If anything, it makes it more impressive that you built what you built. But I built it on lies. On pretending. On being ashamed of someone who didn't deserve my shame. Then change it. Starting now. It's not too late." As the formal event wound down, an unexpected guest approached Ray. Marcus Ventworth was now in his 80s, stooped and gray, but still recognizable. He walked with a cane, his hands shaking with age or emotion, or both. Ray stiffened when he saw him. This was the man who'd destroyed his career, who'd made the false accusations that had stolen his life. Raymond Ventworth said, his voice raspy. "I don't expect you to accept this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. What I did to you was unforgivable. I was jealous and bitter, and I let it turn me into someone terrible. I've lived with the guilt for 40 years. It's eaten me alive." Ray stared at the man who'd been his villain for so long. He waited for the surge of anger of vindication. But looking at this frail, regretful old man, all he felt was tired. Why, he asked, simply, "Why did you do it? Because you were better than me. Because you had everything I wanted. Because I convinced myself that if I couldn't have success, I deserved to take yours. I was wrong. So incredibly wrong. That piece your granddaughter played tonight, that was extraordinary. You were always extraordinary. And I tried to destroy something beautiful because I was small and petty. I'm sorry." Ray was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "I'm not going to say it's okay, because it's not. What you did cost me decades. It cost me my marriage, my relationship with my daughter, my career. I can't get those years back." Ventworth nodded, tears in his eyes. But Ray continued, "I'm also not going to carry hate anymore. It's too heavy. So, I accept your apology. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace." They shook hands, two old men who'd been trapped in the same story for 40 years, finally releasing each other from it. Later that night, after the gala had ended, the Thompson family sat in their living room. It was past midnight. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, still wearing the leather jacket, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the evening. Ray sat in an armchair, sipping the coffee Patricia had made him. It was the first time he'd been in his daughter's house. "What happens now?" Patricia asked quietly. "For you?" Ray shrugged. "I don't know. Keep driving trucks, I guess. Keep teaching Lily if you'll let me. If I'll let you, Dad, after tonight. She's yours to teach. Clearly, you've done more for her musical education in 6 months than I managed in years. It's not about the time. It's about the approach. She's got real talent, Patty. Like nothing I've seen. If she wants to pursue music seriously, she could be extraordinary." "Is that what you want?" "Lily," Patricia asked, looking at her sleeping daughter. "For her to become a musician. What I want," Ray said carefully, "is for her to be whoever she's meant to be. If that's a musician, great. If it's something else, equally great. The important thing is that she doesn't spend her life being someone she's not out of fear." Patricia felt the gentle rebuke in his words. "I did that, didn't I? Spent my whole life being someone I wasn't. You survived. You built something. There's no shame in that. But maybe now you can do both. Be successful and be real." As Patricia drove Ray home later that night, they talked more openly than they had in 30 years. About the past. About regrets. About the possibility of rebuilding their relationship. "I know I can't make up for lost time," Patricia said as they pulled up to Ray's house. "But I'd like to try, if you'll let me." Ray looked at his daughter, seeing glimpses of the little girl she'd been beneath the sophisticated woman she'd become. "We've got time now, Patty. Let's not waste it." They hugged in the car, holding each other the way they hadn't since Patricia was 9 years old, and her world hadn't yet fallen apart. 6 months later, the Thompson family sat in the audience at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. The historic venue was packed, every seat filled, people standing in the back. The marquee outside read Raymond Coleman, Redemption Tour, 1 night only. After the viral video of Lily's performance at the charity gala had spread across the internet, everything had changed for Ray. Music journalists had written retrospectives on his career. Old fans had reconnected. And most significantly, a jazz label had reached out about recording his work. The album, titled Redemption Song, after his signature composition, was set to release the following month. But tonight was about something more. This was Ray's return to the Apollo, the venue where he'd once triumphed and from which he'd been exiled. This was him reclaiming his place in music history. Lily sat between her parents, wearing the leather jacket Ray had given her. She'd barely taken it off since that night at the gala. It had become her armor, her reminder of courage. The lights dimmed, a spotlight hit the stage, and Ray walked out to thunderous applause. He looked different than he had 6 months ago. Still weathered, still rough around the edges, but standing taller, carrying himself with a confidence that had been missing for decades. He wore a simple black suit, his silver beard neatly trimmed, his eyes bright with emotion. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and he began to play. The concert was everything that music should be. Raw and polished, technical and emotional, personal and universal. Ray played his old compositions and new ones. He played songs that told his story and songs that transcended his individual experience to speak to something larger. But the centerpiece, the moment everyone was waiting for, came near the end. "I'm going to play something special now," Ray said into the microphone. "A piece I wrote 40 years ago and never thought would see the light of day. It was rescued from obscurity by someone very special to me. My granddaughter Lily, could you come up here?" Lily's eyes went wide. She looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. She made her way to the stage, her heart pounding. Ray pulled another bench beside his at the piano. "We're going to play this together, the way it was always meant to be played. Not as a solo, but as a conversation between generations, between past and future." They began to play Redemption Song as a duet. Ray took the melodic lead while Lily provided harmonies and counterpoint. Their hands moved across the keys in synchronization. Two musicians separated by age and experience, but united by blood and love and understanding. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't just a performance, it was a testimony, a declaration, a proof that talent could survive suppression, that art could outlive scandal, that redemption was always possible if you were brave enough to reach for it. When they finished, the standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. People were openly weeping. Strangers embraced. Flash bulbs went off as journalists captured the moment. In their seats, Patricia and Thomas stood with everyone else clapping until their hands hurt. Patricia's face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. Really smiling. Not the careful, controlled smile of someone maintaining an image, but the genuine, unguarded smile of someone who'd finally let go of shame and fear. After the concert backstage, Ray hugged his granddaughter tightly. "Thank you," he whispered into her braided hair. "Thank you for giving an old man his voice back." "You never lost your voice," Grandpa Lily said. "You just stopped believing anyone wanted to hear it. Well, they're hearing it now, because of you. Because you were brave enough to take a risk. You taught me that. You taught me that music isn't about playing it safe. It's about telling the truth." Ray pulled back to look at her. "That's right. And you know what the truth is? The truth is that talent isn't enough. Success isn't enough. Fame isn't enough. What matters is having people who believe in you, who see you, who refuse to let you disappear even when you want to." He looked over at Patricia, who stood a few feet away talking to a music journalist. "I lost a lot of years with your mother. I can't get those back. But I've got years ahead. We've got years ahead. And I'm not going to waste them." As the family left the Apollo that night, walking out into the Harlem night with its lights and noise and energy, they were different people than they'd been 6 months ago. Ray was no longer hiding from his past. Patricia was no longer ashamed of her father. Lily was no longer constrained by expectations of what she should be. They'd learned that redemption isn't about erasing mistakes or pretending the past didn't happen. It's about acknowledging what was lost while choosing to move forward anyway. It's about finding courage in the face of fear, authenticity in the face of pressure to conform, and connection in the face of decades of separation. Music had saved them. Or more accurately, a 10-year-old girl's determination to honor her grandfather had saved them, had shown them all that sometimes the most radical act is simply telling the truth. Playing the song you're meant to play, even when everyone expects something different. As they drove home that night, Lily fell asleep in the back seat, Ray's leather jacket wrapped around her like a blanket. Patricia looked at her daughter in the rear-view mirror, then at Thomas beside her, then thought about her father probably still at the Apollo signing autographs and reconnecting with old friends. Her family. Imperfect and complicated and beautiful and real. She'd spent so long trying to construct a perfect image, a perfect life, a perfect family. And in the end, what mattered wasn't perfection. It was truth. It was connection. It was the courage to be fully, authentically yourself, even when it's scary. Especially when it's scary. The piano performance at the charity gala had lasted 10 minutes. The standing ovation had lasted another 5. But the ripple effects would last lifetimes. Would change how the Thompsons saw themselves and each other. Would give Ray back his career and his dignity. Would show Lily that her voice mattered, that taking risks was worth it, that some things were more important than fitting in. Sometimes one moment, one decision, one act of courage can change everything. Sometimes all it takes is a 10-year-old girl brave enough to play one note, and then another, and another, until a symphony of redemption fills the room and everyone who hears it is transformed.